Lieutenant Colonel Custer has met his demise. This is a catastrophe, yet what follows is even more terrifying. After enduring numerous atrocities at the hands of the Americans, Sitting Bull's people desire more than mere victory. They seek humiliation. The brutality Custer inflicted upon them will be avenged in full. Certain details were so appalling that they had to be concealed from the American populace. Bodies were desecrated, men were mutilated beyond recognition, and Custer himself was so severely brutalized that the army felt compelled to deceive his widow. This is the hidden truth regarding the events that transpired following Custer's last stand. For the triumphant Lakota and Cheyenne, it was only natural to begin by plundering their fallen adversaries. The American soldiers possessed various valuable items that now rightfully belonged to the victors. They would have acted in the same manner had the outcome of the battle been reversed. Weapons, jewelry, clothing, badges, and even horses left on the battlefield were now theirs for the taking. Lakota warrior Brave Bear recounted, "There was much commotion and disputes over the horses and guns that were seized. Indians were heard exchanging words such as, 'I acquired some tobacco, I obtained coffee, I secured a fine gun.' For the warriors, the spoils were a well-deserved reward. However, this looting process was not gentle towards the deceased. Nearly all of them were stripped of their garments and left to decay naked under the sun. The Lakota and Cheyenne customarily took scalps from their vanquished foes, and this occasion was no exception. For hours following the battle, the hills presented a horrifying scene of warriors removing the scalps of the slain as war trophies. It was not solely the men who were targeted. Native accounts vividly recall how the women of the camp also approached and desecrated the bodies. 2 Cheyenne women claimed to have driven nails into Custer's ears. Years later, it was disclosed that someone had forced an arrow into an unspeakable location within Custer's trousers, a detail that the army kept under wraps to spare his widow from distress. According to the Lakota warrior Ironhawk, some of Custer's soldiers pretended to be dead to evade capture by the opposing forces, only to be discovered by these women. He recalled witnessing 2 elderly women strip one corpse and begin to dismember it, only for the soldier to suddenly rise and attempt to fend them off. The soldier was swiftly killed. However, Ironhawk found the sight of a naked man trying to fend off 2 elderly women to be quite amusing. One individual who reportedly did not find it amusing was Sitting Bull. He claimed that his visions had predicted a significant victory, yet they also cautioned him that if his warriors disturbed the deceased, they would face a curse. Whether Sitting Bull genuinely opposed the mutilation remains uncertain. Interviews with him occurred only years after his defeat. He may have simply been trying to distance himself from actions that the public deemed scandalous. Nevertheless, the battle did not conclude with Custer's demise. The majority of the 7th Cavalry remained alive. Under the command of Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benton, they had entrenched themselves atop Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors launched an assault against them throughout the night of the 25th and all day on the 26th. They only ceased their attack on the morning of the 27th, when their scouts spotted the approach of American reinforcements. Benton and Reno had been too preoccupied with their fight for survival to ascertain what had transpired with Custer. It was actually the reinforcements led by General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon who first comprehended the magnitude of the catastrophe at Little Bighorn. Gibbon's scouts were the first to encounter the bloodied garments of American officers in deserted camps not far from the battlefield. These had been taken from the deceased, but were abandoned when Sitting Bull retreated. The news of this gruesome discovery had scarcely reached Gibbon and Terry when a second scout arrived with even more dire news. "I have counted 197 dead bodies lying in the hills," the scout reported. "Were they white men?" was the first question posed. "Yes, they were white men," the scout responded. Terry and Gibbon then understood that something had gone horribly awry. Gibbon and Terry were apprehensive that the entire 7th Cavalry might have been annihilated, but their scouts quickly located the survivors of Benton and Reno on the nearby hills. Terry and Gibbon hurried to meet them. They discovered Benton and Reno, who were battered yet alive, along with most of their men. Both men were unaware of Custer's calamity and had presumed he had deserted them to pursue Lori. They were swiftly corrected. Benton and a portion of his men were sent to locate Custer. What they encountered was disastrous. The exposed corpses of their comrades had already begun to decompose after 2 days under the scorching Montana sun. They initially found the bodies of L Company, commanded by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. They remained in the defensive formation they had assumed in their final moments atop Calhoun Hill. Most of the other bodies did not exhibit such a formation. It was uncertain whether they had all perished in a panic or if the Native Americans had relocated the bodies afterward. Another group of bodies was concentrated on what became known as Last Stand Hill. It was Private Jacob Adams who first discovered the 7th commanding officer. He promptly called Captain Benton, who hurried over to verify his identity. "By God," Benton responded, "that is him." George Custer's body was located near the summit of Last Stand Hill, 20 feet away from his brother Tom. Like the other men, he had been stripped of all his clothing except for his socks. General Custer had not been scalped, although Tom had. The body was found sitting upright against the bodies of 2 other soldiers, as if at rest. His expression resembled that of a man who had merely fallen asleep, Lieutenant James Bradley later noted. The remaining 200 bodies from Custer's command were scattered between the hills and the river near Sitting Bull's abandoned camp. In a letter to a newspaper, Lieutenant Bradley informed the public that the bodies of the fallen had not been mistreated. There was minimal mutilation, he stated in his correspondence. The injuries he observed seemed to result from finishing off a wounded individual, and nothing beyond that. Regrettably, he was not truthful. I have come across Lieutenant Bradley's assertion that the corpses were not significantly mutilated. Private Charles Windolph, one of the soldiers who accompanied Benteen to the battlefield, later remarked, "It was considerate of him to protect the feelings of the bereaved. However, the bodies were indeed severely mutilated, some to an extent that was too horrific to describe. Most of the corpses were marred in some dreadful manner. For instance, Isaiah Dorman, a black scout, was extensively mutilated, and the enemy had left a kettle filled with his own blood beside him as a form of insult. The majority of the bodies had been scalped. Many had been pierced with arrows or had suffered damage from axes or hammers post-mortem. The entire battlefield was a display of brutality. Custer did not escape this treatment either. Officially, the soldiers only documented his visible wounds. One bullet wound was located in the chest below the heart, and another in his left temple. Either of these could have proved fatal. Additionally, there was a knife wound in his thigh. The soldiers reached a consensus not to disclose that an arrow had been inserted in a humiliating location in his trousers. Such a detail would only distress his widow and was kept confidential for many years. His brother Tom had suffered even greater injuries. He had been scalped. His skull was crushed, and he had been disemboweled. Had it not been for the tattoo discovered on his arm, he would have been unidentifiable. Given that 2 days had elapsed since the battle, the bodies were already in a state of decomposition by the time they were discovered. 2 days under the summer Montana sun exacerbated the situation significantly. Colonel Gibbon acknowledged that the bodies had already become repugnant by the time he arrived. The sight and odor of the deceased would forever haunt those who witnessed it. Many individuals hold the belief that by the time Benteen arrived at Custer's Hill, all were deceased. However, this assertion is not entirely accurate. Private Jacob Adams, who asserted he was the first to discover Custer, also made another remarkable finding on that very hill. As Adams and his fellow soldiers navigated through the devastation, they heard a distress sound emanating from among the deceased. A solitary survivor called out to them, a 14-year-old bay horse named Comanche. Comanche belonged to one of Custer's officers, whose body lay nearby. The horse had sustained 7 separate wounds from bullets and arrows and had not had water for several days. Nevertheless, he remained by his master's side. Adams and the soldiers hurried to provide assistance. After all, no man serves in the cavalry without a deep respect for its horses. Despite his injuries, Comanche managed to stand and rejoin the remainder of the 7th Cavalry. Other surviving horses were also retrieved from the surrounding area. However, Comanche's injuries and his solitary presence on Last Stand Hill garnered him particular attention. He eventually recovered from his wounds and enjoyed a lengthy retirement as the mascot of the 7th Cavalry before passing away in 1891. Comanche is one of only 4 horses to receive a funeral with full military honors. June 27th was dedicated to counting and identifying the deceased. Many bodies could not be identified, and those that were often lacked certainty in their identification. Additionally, there were 19 bodies from the battle that were never located. In the years following the battle, human remains continued to be discovered in the hills surrounding the battlefield, indicating that some men may have escaped the initial turmoil at Last Stand Hill, but were subsequently hunted down. On the morning of June 28th, the soldiers commenced the burial of the dead. Ben's team counted 208 bodies to be interred that day, while Lieutenant Bradley recorded 206. Regardless of the actual number, the task was performed hastily. They were concerned that Sitting Bull or other hostile Native Americans might appear, which prevented them from taking the necessary time to dig 200 proper graves. Consequently, most of the deceased were interred together in hurried mass graves or in shallow graves at the locations where they had fallen. Some graves were marked with their names. Custer and his brother Tom were laid to rest together. A grave was excavated at the base of the hill, measuring barely 2 feet deep, just sufficient to cover the bodies. The brothers were wrapped in canvas and positioned side by side. To deter scavengers, a small sled and a circle of stones were placed nearby. There are varying accounts regarding who precisely dug the grave and interred Custer, as several men sought to claim this honor. By 6:30 p.m., the task was completed. General Terry was keen to depart and commenced the lengthy march back to the main Bighorn River, setting out that evening. There remained 50 wounded men who required proper medical attention, and it was imperative to relay news of the defeat back to the authorities. The journey back to the confluence of the Little Bighorn and Bighorn Rivers was long, where the steamer Far West awaited the wounded. Medics provided what assistance they could during the journey. At least one man underwent a leg amputation, but several others regrettably succumbed to their injuries. The aftermath imposed a significant burden on the survivors. Major Reno resorted to alcohol. In the 22 days following his return from Little Bighorn, he purchased 11 gallons of whiskey. Captain Benteen also turned to drinking as a coping mechanism. This resulted in a drunken altercation between Benteen and Captain Thomas Weir, who accused Benteen of abandoning Custer during the battle. Benteen refused to tolerate the accusation and challenged Weir to a duel to defend his honor, which Weir declined. Unable to bear the guilt of Little Bighorn for long, Weir would ultimately be found dead in his hotel room in New York in December 1876. The steamer Far West hurried up the Missouri River, carrying news of the defeat along with 38 of the wounded. It broke speed records as it completed the 710-mile journey back to the 7th Cavalry's Fort Abraham Lincoln in under 3 days. The sound of the ship's arrival roused Libby Custer before dawn on July 6th. Shortly thereafter, at 7 a.m., a group of high-ranking officers from the fort knocked on her door. Libby hurried to answer, where the officers insisted on speaking with her privately. By this time, her sister-in-law Maggie was also awake. Maggie was equally anxious for news regarding her brothers and her husband, Lieutenant James Calhoun, who had served alongside them. The officers escorted the women to the parlor, where they conveyed the heartbreaking news. Libby and George had been sweethearts since their teenage years and had been married for 12 years. Their surviving love letters reveal the depth of their affection for one another. His passing was utterly devastating for her. One of the officers, Lieutenant Gurley, recalled it as one of the most difficult tasks he had ever undertaken. Imagine the sorrow of those bereaved women, their cries, their tears flowing without end. To her credit, Libby Custer did not allow her sorrow to impede her responsibilities. She insisted on accompanying the officers to inform the other 26 women in the fort who had now become widows. The remainder of Libby Custer's life was shaped by the losses she endured at Little Bighorn. She would uphold her husband's legacy and assign blame for the calamity to Reno and Benteen until her passing in 1933. The news became public the following day. Washington received the news via telegraph that morning. Just 3 days after celebrating the nation's 100th birthday, the news of Custer's defeat was a shocking revelation. The story dominated the newspapers for several days, and speculation ran rampant. Many began to seek someone to hold accountable. Was it Custer's recklessness? The failures of Benteen and Reno? The nation could only grieve the aftermath of one of the most significant defeats they would ever experience at the hands of the Native Americans.